Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. For this episode, we'll explore themes of how racism and prejudice exist in Canadian sports. Author Ian Kennedy has uncovered stories about marginalized athletes, both famous and obscure from past and present. Many of these stories are centered in the Chatham-Kent region. This area has historically been home to many different races, including a large Black community with connections to the Underground Railroad, and Indigenous peoples from Walpole Island and Delaware First Nations. Kennedy's book, On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport, reveals how systemic racism has historically impacted sports and still persists today. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters, Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've always loved storytelling. I've loved hearing stories, and typically from my grandparents sitting at a table just like this one and hearing the same stories over and over that they love to tell about their own coming to Canada story. But over time, I started writing about sports, and I loved sports, but I also loved the intersection of social justice and issues that come with that, not just the games and the scores. And in Chatham-Kent, I started learning about stories that I'd never heard before. Visiting the Black Mecca Museum and the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society, I was meeting people and hearing about things that didn't sound anything like the stories I'd heard growing up. Were stories that I thought should be known by more people. And so when the pandemic rolled around, I decided to start putting some of those down. I had the time, and luckily enough, a book came out of it. So it was just a kind of
serendipitous.
Yeah, it was serendipitous,
Yeah.
Especially in the way that my publishing company found me. I was sitting in the Black Mecca Museum and researching for a story I was going to write. And Sam, the executive director there, said, "Ian, I just got this email from a publishing company wondering if anyone in town is writing about the Chatham Colored All-Stars baseball team." And I looked over and said, "I'm doing that." And she said, "Yeah, you're doing that." And so we replied to the email together right then and there. And a couple of days later, I had a Zoom meeting with Tidewater Press, and here we are.
Wow. So, On Account of Darkness, what does it mean?
Well, of course, it's a little bit of a double entendre of what it actually means. The original story of On Account of Darkness comes from those Chatham Colored All-Stars. In 1934, of course, they were an all-Black baseball team playing in Chatham, and they were very good. They were only a couple of outs away from winning the provincial championship, which made them the first ever and still only all-Black baseball team to do that in Canada. And up 3-2 in that game, the umpires called the game On Account of Darkness at 4 p.m. in the afternoon.
That's
when,
not
of course,
very
it's
dark.
not dark. No. So the players and their ancestors all say that the only reason it was too dark is because there was 9 Black baseball players on the field. So On Account of Darkness is it plays on that historic moment, as well as the sometimes how we view racialized people.
It's a very clever title. Now, as I mentioned, the book is very much centered in Chatham-Kent, and you found that Chatham-Kent area and its makeup is somewhat of a multicultural microcosm of Canada. So, are there differences to how athletes were treated there compared to the rest of Canada?
Not really. I don't think, I think it was very, so we use the way microcosm of Canada because Canada kind of presents ourselves as this all-encompassing, all-welcoming country, when of course we have the exact same issues historically that many other places faced, whether it was slavery or segregation or residential schools. So we kind of represented that homogenous group of people that fought to keep others out. And so that's kind of the way that Chatham-Kent represented Canada as a whole, because we are a location of 2 sites on the Underground Railroad where people might think, oh, that meant that Chatham-Kent was welcoming and fought for freedom, but it's actually quite the opposite.
How surprised were you at the level of racism you discovered?
Well, growing up there, not that surprised. There was many incidents of racism that I witnessed growing up that I was kind of baked within. I was raised in a way that that taught us stereotypes about particularly Indigenous people where I lived in Wallsburg. But the incidents of fighting freedom from slavery, I always thought that those locations, whether it be Buxton or Dresden, the Don settlement there, which became known as Uncle Tom's Cabin, has since been renamed. But I always thought those spots were meant that we were really welcoming and that we worked to help escaped slaves settle, and it just wasn't the case. So that was definitely shocking to me, and the role of sport and all that was really eye-opening as well.
How difficult was it to uncover the stories, or did you find that people were not reluctant to talk to you, or was there some reluctance?
I think there was some reluctance to begin until people knew my motives, until people sat at a table like this with me and just we talked. Because the oral histories, there was a want and a need for some of those stories to be put down, because in our country and in Chatham-Kent and all over, those stories aren't told as often of racialized people. Typically sport history has been whitewashed to be the same people over and over that we always saw, the Wayne Gretzkys and the Gordie Howes and people like that. But there's other athletes that were as incredible that just, for reasons that the book highlights, whether it was racism or prejudice or segregation, didn't have access to the same opportunities.
Tell me about some of those athletes, some of the ones who really stood out for you.
Well, Fergie Jenkins is kind of the highlight athlete of the book. Of course, his father played on that Chatham Colored All-Stars team, and his story is interesting. But for me, it was more of the hometown people. There's a man in here named Jerry Bingo who I've become very good friends with. Bob Azumi, who's a famous Canadian TV celebrity, fisherman, meeting him and finding other Japanese Canadian in my community. There's a man that lives only about a half a kilometer from me named Pat Cosby that shows up in the book. But some of the surprising ones for me were Canadian Olympian Vicky Sunahara, who I had no idea was from our area because it was never talked about, and Mel and Herb Wakabayashi, Bill Sands, who's become a very good friend of mine, and his daughter Alyssa from Walpole Island First Nation. I thought that story in the book was really just shocking and surprising and eye-opening to me and powerful in so many ways.
Share briefly what that was about.
So Bill Sands was taken to the Mohawk Institute Residential School at age 11. And much like many kids that were taken there, he underwent abuse and on a daily basis was subject to fights and beatings and stripped of his culture and all of those things. And when he came back to Walpole Island, he really didn't know what he was going to do. He was still only a teenager, and he took up hunting and fishing and guiding for people. And
became quite famous
over it. He's guided for multiple prime ministers and presidents of various countries, and Cher and Alex Del Vecchio and Bobby Orr and people like that, where, if you're a celebrity that's loved hunting, you've probably met him at one point in time. And his story of how going back to the land and reconnecting with hunting and fishing helped him kind of re-identify and gain back that culture that had been stripped away was really powerful. And sitting with him in those Old Oak Savannah woods and hearing his stories about the wild ponies that used to run there, and seeing his daughter take me to the place where she shot her first deer. And those are just the powerful moments that I don't think people see unless you humanize stories about racism and race and get to know people beyond what we might see in the news.
And there were some really interesting things. Most people call lacrosse Canada's national game, and it's sort of tossed up there with hockey. But that was an Indigenous sport. Of
course, it was. And it's kind of typical of, or typifies maybe how we view Western colonial sports. It was supposed to be a medicine game. It was, the game that the creator gave to Indigenous people. And it was designed to be this social aspect that was good for physical health and mental health, which is what we all think sports should be probably. And then it was, of course, taken in its own way and colonized. When arenas went indoors for hockey, arena owners needed something to fill the arenas during the summertime. And so indoor lacrosse was created. And it was kind of claimed as Canada's game, despite the fact that it very much was not. Even the name lacrosse itself is French. So definitely a game that was taken and is now being reclaimed, but it took a long time.
Do you see racism and oppression in sports mirrored in other aspects of Canadian life?
I think that's what I wanted the book to do in some way, was show that it's pervasive and there's no aspect of life. People always say, stick to sports when I'm writing about these types of topics, but you can't, because it infiltrates every aspect. And so I used sport as a lens to look at the issues of racism in Canada and to hopefully make those topics accessible to some people that might not otherwise pick up a book on racism, but maybe if they saw famous athletes' names or wanted to learn about a team like the Chatham-Kent All-Stars, who have recently been inducted into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame.
Yes.
Maybe they would learn something about the issues that those athletes faced and why we still have those issues in sport.
Did you have conversations about activism, athletes feeling empowered to take a more sort of active voice and action? We had the sprinters, Carlos and Tommy Smith, who raised their black gloves fists, and quarterback Colin Kaepernick in the U.S., the NHL defenseman Subban, speaking about how a gesture considered to be racist was leveled against his younger brother. So we seem to be seeing more of it. Are we? And what do you think is empowering athletes to do this?
It's definitely there. It's been there in history that sport has become that avenue where sometimes racialized athletes could gain access to otherwise forbidden places. Arenas were segregated, pools were segregated, all of these things where there was no access. So sometimes that talent or skill was what opened doorways to either being around people where they could have those meaningful conversations, or as a stage to talk about or to protest. And I think we're definitely seeing more of it. Colin Kaepernick, of course, was one of the most prevalent examples recently, but it really is, I think, empowering to a lot of people to see these famous athletes using that voice and that stage. And of course, again, people say stick to sports. They don't, a lot of people want just the entertainment value of sport, but that's a really, they are human beings playing those sports, and these issues impact them, whether it's on the field or court or, in the streets or at their homes. So there's no disconnect. And I think sport can be a really powerful avenue to have those conversations.
And speaking about athletes and big name sports teams, just recently, there's been a movement to drop a lot of the Indigenous references from the names of various sports teams. But one thing I found very interesting in the book is that the Cleveland Indians have a tie to a Chatham athlete.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections there with sports and those Indigenous athletes and why those names have come to be. But there was a gentleman named Ed Penance who was technically the first Indigenous baseball player in Major League Baseball, and Louis Socrates kind of gets that moniker with the Cleveland baseball team, but Penance actually had that as being the first quote unquote full-blooded, which of course is a very racist way to look at something anyways. And it was by a measure called blood quantum. But he learned the game of baseball at Shingwauk Residential School and brought it back to Walpole Island, and then later went to the Carlisle boarding school, which is the same as our residential schools in the States. He met Jim Thorpe there, who's of course a very famous Olympian and advocate as well, professional football player. And the ties between those names and where they came from, there is, I think, some historical ties, but it's the idea that it was generally, a white businessman that took that name for their own benefit to represent themselves without consulting with any community, without community members in indigenous nations being at all tied to that or benefiting from the sport. And that's, of course, why that appropriation is hopefully now changing everywhere.
Because I'm going to get you to read from your book in a second, but did they say that they called it Cleveland Indians as a tribute?
Yes, they did.
To him.
Yeah, they did. And that's, the tribute for who, I'm not sure. But,
well, we'd love to have you read something from your book.
Great. So when I do these readings, I typically don't like to read other people's voices because I do recognize that I'm a white person discussing these issues. And so I typically like to read my own sections, which each chapter kind of begins with an anecdote of my own. So I'm going to start with one from chapter 13, Sundown Town, which talks about my hometown of Wallaceburg. In Wallaceburg, sunset can be a beautiful time, especially along the Sydenham River. A town of roughly 10,000 people, Wallaceburg was built on manufacturing. The famous Louisville Slugger baseball bats and Louisville hockey sticks were both made here. Hall of Famers like Mark Messier, Steve Yzerman, and Brett Hull would all visit to test their new hockey sticks. Wallaceburg is connected by waterways to the Great Lakes. On summer days, the brown water slowly meanders through town, and long shadows creep out from the poplar trees. The quiet interrupted only by the sound of car tires rumbling across the 4 main bridges. Light shimmers on the wake of small boats driven by town teenagers, and kids sneak onto the old train bridge to drink cheap beer and swim in the turbid water. There's almost certainly a father and son standing behind the local library fishing from the boardwalk. In the center of town is a walking bridge where pedestrians can wave at boaters and teens can steal a kiss in the fading light, and where a black taxicab driver was threatened with lynching if he dared stay overnight in the town. So, of course, that's talking about sundown towns, which meant that black individuals could not stay in a town after dark. And that was a law in Wallaceburg created by fights between 2 baseball teams where Dresden, which had a large black community, would bring black wrestlers and boxers to town after they realized that there would be brawls following the games. And so the rule became that any black person that wanted to enter Wallaceburg would need to fight a shipbuilder or someone that they had selected. And eventually the rule was formed. And it was later ended by another famous athlete, Canadian Football Hall of Famer Rolly Miles. But you're going to have to read the book to get that story. So, and then I'll read just one other small section here, which because Fergie Jenkins is one of the most famous athletes.
He certainly is.
So from chapter 16, the chapter is called A Parade for Fergie. And it's just a small anecdote again of kind of the 2 sides of things in our town. For years, I would follow the same truck on my way to work. The driver and I likely woke at almost the same time, checked the same weather reports. Maybe we sat down at similar tables and drank our coffee, and then stood to gather our coats and shoes. The darkest hours seemed to be those just prior to sunrise, my turn signal illuminating the world in intervals. As I pulled onto the highway, the man in his truck would pull out ahead of me like clockwork. I could see his eyes in the glow of my headlights on his rearview mirror. There in the darkness on the road in front of me, he'd accelerate. My beams would strike the tailgate of his truck and bring to life the Confederate flag painted there. Each morning I wondered about that man. We were in Canada after all. This flag had no geographic origin here, but it did have meaning. Eventually, the driver of that truck would pass a sign reading, "Welcome to Chatham, home of Fergie Jenkins." So, of course, someone driving with a very racist symbol on their vehicle and then going into a town to work that
honors Fergie Jenkins.
Is honored. Yeah. And that's so prevalent, I think, in the book that we have this dichotomy of what we say we are and what we think we do and who we actually are at times. And our region, unfortunately, represents a lot of those things, but it's not isolated here. Of course, it's a Canadian-wide problem.
And going back to athletes and, them, their activism and speaking out, in June of this year, Golf Canada announced that its golfers would be free to speak about social justice issues. Do you see more sports organizations taking that stance and allowing athletes to sort of feel that they have more freedom to speak out? Or not?
Well, I don't know if there's a lot of freedom for athletes to speak out. I think if there was, we would see more of it. And I think the burden is being placed oftentimes on racialized athletes to speak out about racism. It's being placed on victims of sexual violence to speak out about abuse in sport. And we don't see it from other people necessarily. We don't see it. Not a lot of NHL players have spoken out about Hockey Canada. Not a lot of white athletes speak out about racism that is ongoing in sport. But the avenue is there. I'm just not sure if it's welcomed fully because there is a price to pay for speaking sometimes. And that could be being ostracized or cast as an outsider. And we definitely do see that in sport. Even someone like PK Subban, who you mentioned earlier, he retired this year, but he's still a very capable NHL player. And he was traded for his personality. But I think that most people could read between the lines of what that actually meant.
You've done, so much research on this and you've talked to so many people. How effective do you think an athlete can be at leading change?
Extremely effective. They are a person that's in the spotlight. They're already a role model for one reason. People look up to athletes for that, we dream of being in the place of many of these people. And I think that person has a very unique opportunity to be a voice for change, to start programming for youth to be that change and to, again, just speak out and to shine a light on the issues because it is there. And not too often does someone get to speak to the media every single night and have it plastered across radio stations and newspapers globally. And athletes do get that opportunity.
Now, just recently, a golfer Cheryl Mitchell of Walpole Island First Nation won the women's division at the first ever Ontario Indigenous Golf Championship run by Golf Ontario. Do you think that tournaments like this are going to ultimately pave the way for more Indigenous another generation of Indigenous athletes?
Absolutely. And Cheryl, her family, the Tushkaning family, is represented in the book. She was interviewed for the book, and we grew up on opposite sides of the hallway in high school, we'll say, because at my school, there was always a lot of fights between Indigenous and white people. But those types of events, whether it's reclaiming the Team Iroquois or the new Anishinaabe teams that are representing lacrosse or these golf tournaments, are really allowing nationhood to be looked at in a different way and to create a new generation of role models for racialized or minority athletes, and to give, Cheryl is a wonderful example of that, of someone that is just a great human being, but honors her culture and her background, and now is very successful athletically and hopefully inspiring others to do the same.
You must have heard a lot of stories, especially I know the Chatham Colored All-Stars. I mean, just being inducted to the Sports Hall of Fame is quite incredible. But you heard some pretty sort of sad stories from how they were treated.
Yeah, there was a lot of moments sitting recording an interview where we had to take a break, or one or both of us would have a little cry, and because it was very human, it was very real, and it's generational to even, there's no surviving member of that Chatham Colored All-Stars baseball team, but the kids feel, and the kid, saying kids, they're in their 70s and 80s, some of them now, they still feel the importance of the team. And when they talk about their fathers being spit on and their mothers being yelled at in the stands, and kids being encouraged to throw rocks at the team, those are very real and powerful feelings, the same as we talk about with the generational trauma of residential schools. So it's alive.
Yeah. You hear about the blacks and the whites restaurants and water coolers and everything in the US, but these Chatham athletes also were segregated from restaurants and hotels.
Absolutely. Even at the time of that, the team winning, they were paraded down the main street of Chatham. But, the very next morning, if they had wanted to go for breakfast in any one of those restaurants that the parade went by, they wouldn't have been welcomed. They went back to working as shoe shiners and bellboys and cleaning spittoons and just things like that, where the opportunities weren't there. And a lot of those after events, they spoke out and said, if you really want to honor us, give us jobs and allow us to enter this part of town without having an issue. So
horrible time.
Horrible time.
So at the end of it all, when you look into the future, are you optimistic about how sports will eventually will it even itself out? Will it become inclusive?
I hope so. I end the book on a positive note with a story of a Black friend of my daughter playing on the same baseball team, and how we hope that there will never be another game called on account of darkness for anyone. But there are a lot of issues to fix, and sport itself needs fixing because it can be weaponized against those communities just as much as it can be an avenue for protest or inclusion. But I am hopeful. But there's a lot of work to do. And I hope that by people reading this book, they can understand some of that work.
And are you taking that into your school?
Absolutely. It's, anti-racist initiatives and anti-oppressive education are so crucial at every level in the workplace and in our schools and on sports teams. So it's definitely something that's all over my life.
Thank you so much for sharing this.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport is published by Tidewater Press and available at Chapters Indigo and on Amazon, and it is certainly worth the read. And that's all for this episode of Scribes and Songsters. Many thanks to our guest, author Ian Kennedy. Thanks to our Scribes and Songsters team, producer Liz Pettipies-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and consultant Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you soon, right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.